Veterans Association, I want to welcome you to the 131st consecutive meeting of the Lexington Vets. Thank you for making this program so successful. Wonderful to see you all back. I hope everyone had a good summer, and we're delighted with the audience we have today. We have a great program for you, and we have a lot of announcements because it's the first time we're together in a few months, so we have to get started right away. So first thing we'll do is please rise for our Pledge of Allegiance, led by Jim Ramsey.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Now, the slide that you see in front, you may recognize Pat Flynn. Pat is a veteran of World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. A handful of such veterans in the entire nation. He's still going strong at the age of 94?
95.
95. Thank you, Edith. Pat's wife, Edith, is here. The Lexington High School football team decided that they wanted to start a new tradition of honoring veterans at each game. And Pat was given the honor of being the first veteran at the opening game. And Pat and Edith went to dinner with the football team the night before the game, and then this picture was taken at the Friday night opening game with members of the Lexington Minutemen. Edith, do you want to just say a couple of words on what it was like or anything?
Well, it was just great to meet so many young people and enthusiastic. So we just told them a little bit about my husband's background, his combat in 3 wars on the front lines all of the time. And the kids all lined up spontaneously and shook his hand. So it was really a lovely experience for him, and that was what counts.
That's great. So we were really happy to be able to help make that happen. Okay, next announcement. We have our fall schedule of programs put together. I believe you all received it by email. We've been having a little website difficulty, but you did get it by email. We have hard copy available on the table against the wall if you'd like to take a copy home with you. It's a great set of programs, so we look forward to having you with us for the fall. And you found a little flyer on your seat that basically says, "Help us find surviving veterans of World War II." A committee has been established that in 2020 will put on a series of events over 5 or 6 months commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Amazing. And one of the things that this committee wants very much to do is to identify every single surviving World War II veteran we can find to honor them in the way they deserve at some point in a celebration next year. So if you know such a veteran, know of one, think you know somebody who knows one, help us do a search and use the contact information on the card and let us know so we can have a proper celebration and honor these people the way they deserve. Thank you. Okay, we have a special guest today. You know we always thank Starbucks in Lexington Center for the coffee, and I swear, even though our programs are excellent, I think the coffee is part of the reason why everybody comes here. And we are truly pleased to have the manager of Starbucks, Jill Adams. We wanted you to actually meet Jill so you could thank her in person. But I'm going to introduce Jim Ramsey. Jim has a very important job. Jim is our coffee person. Jim goes to Starbucks and picks up the coffee and delivers it here and brings back the urn. So you know what? Jim deserves a hand, okay? We wouldn't have it without Jim. So Jim has developed a terrific working relationship with Jill. He will introduce her and talk about some of the other veteran outreach projects that Starbucks has established. So I want you to give a welcome to Jim and then a welcome to Jill.
Thank you, Linda. It's really a great pleasure to welcome Jill here with us today. I've been doing this coffee work for just the past year or so, and I guess what I want to do is Phil Schaefer here. Phil is here. So 16 years ago, he tells me, Phil got this whole thing started with Starbucks. I guess Phil and Bill Johansson approached them and basically made them an offer they couldn't refuse, which was to start providing us coffee, which is extended continuously through right now, through the delivery today. Those mathematicians among you don't hold me to this, but more or less I figured that over that time we've received something like 500 gallons of coffee, which I think equates to something like 7,000 cups. So, been a lot of meetings. And those meetings are really fueled by Starbucks coffee. So, the least we can do is say thank you to Jill. I also want to say, at least some of you know, I work as a volunteer over at the VA hospital out of the library there, delivering books and really companionship to the veterans in the hospital. Frank Mahoven here, raise your hand, Frank. Frank does the same thing. 6 months ago, Jill asked me whether there was, if you can believe it, whether there was something more that Starbucks could do for the veterans or active duty military. And we talked, and I have a vested interest in the library, so what Jill started and continues today is basically a donation basket in the downtown Lexington Starbucks store, looking for books and magazines and portable DVD players, anything that someone in the hospital might like to pass the time. That has been a great success, thanks to Jill. We take stuff over there every week. The folks appreciate it, and what the heck, I guess as long as I'm here, I'll make a pitch for anyone here who wants to make a donation to that basket. It would be more than welcome. So Starbucks has done a lot, does a lot for veterans, and I know Jill wanted to, in addition to getting a warm recognition, had a few things to say to us, so I'll turn the floor over to her.
Hey, Jill.
So I've never talked in front of a large group like this before. So a little closer to my lips. Can everyone hear me now? Cool. So as I was saying, I've never quite talked in front of a group kind of this big before. I'm very new at it, so hopefully you guys will bear with me. But yeah, so I'm Jill Adams. I'm the store manager of our downtown Lexington Starbucks. I've been there for a little under a year now. I think I started on November 1st, something like that. So something that I just try to do is, not just I, but Starbucks as a company, we want to make sure that we're appreciating everybody who has who's supported our country, has supported us in the past. So one of the things that Jim and I have been doing is we have a not tiny, it's like a little cute donation basket right in the front of our store. And then we have this large community board that has a little blurb about the VA hospital, and any type of books, as Jim was saying, portable DVD players, magazines, tapes, really any type of entertainment that we can provide. We also have a couple other locations in the area where we're looking for other types of donations. Let's see, I believe the other Lexington store right down on Bedford Street, they have paired with an active military unit. I'm not quite sure where, but they are receiving donations of non-perishable food items, clothes, really like any type of materials that we can then send over there. So if anybody here has any relations or affiliations with any more like active military units, or really any other ideas that I can give to the other members in my district, I would love that, because we only have 3 stores right now that have affiliations with any type of veterans or active military units, and I think that we have 12 stores in our district, so we definitely have a lot of room to grow. My own personal connection with the military and with everyone here was my grandfather. His name is William Oliver Adams II. I have a little paper here because I am terrible at remembering his story. So yes, he was born in 1930. He joined the Army at the age of 18, where he served in Korea. He also received his Purple Heart after surviving a foxhole where a grenade was thrown in, unfortunately. He was then found and brought to a Marsh hospital, where he was put on a plane to carry him to safety. However, the plane was shot down on takeoff. With the use of the supplies on the plane, he was able to survive, and with his fellow soldier. Soon after, a helicopter came to rescue and transfer them to safety, where it was then shot down on landing. Yeah. He was then shipped to a Boston hospital where he met my where he met my grandmother, who just happened to be at the hospital with her friend who was visiting her boyfriend, who was also in the same hospital room. And I guess my grandfather was very upset that the two were talking, because he was very grumpy. My grandmother, who's feisty little firecracker of a Swede, she gave him plenty of attitude, where they, long story short, they were together for a very long time, had 6 children. My father was the last one of them. She was able to move them all around the country, and she was one heck of a woman, that's for sure. So yeah, I know I talked for a little bit longer than I probably should have, but just wanted to say thank you, everybody here, for everything that you've done. If you have any other ways that me or we as Starbucks can help more, please let me know. You can leave some of my business cards here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jill, and we look forward to a long and rewarding partnership. Thank you. We're so happy you're here. Okay, a couple of other quickies. Pat Costello, where are you? Okay, Pat. Pat is our volunteer with the blue Bedford VA box, and it's time to just update that announcement. Go.
This is kind of anticlimactic, but we have been collecting stationery, calendars, and magazines that I take over to the VA hospital right after our meetings. And it's beginning to be calendar time again. The calendars are very much appreciated by the vets. This is an opportunity for them to keep track of their appointments. So if you have any stationery that you're not going to be using, that you'll be getting, a lot of this you get in the mail because they're looking for solicitations. You can just write on there, thank you, this is going to the Veterans Hospital, and send it back without any money. But at any rate, we do collect on a monthly basis at each one of these meetings, and so I'm looking forward to getting more next month.
Thank you, Pat. As a reminder, in case anybody is new here, we all get so many solicitations from charities, and in them are lovely greeting cards, calendars, note cards, and other gizmos. I mean, I get decks of playing cards, computers. I got a scarf the other day. And I just throw them in the veterans box. The veterans appreciate greeting cards, and all these things are so useful for them. And with us, they're coming off the wazoo, right? Throw them in the box.
New greeting cards, not used ones.
Well, thank you, Pat. I thought that would be understood. Okay. A quick reminder, next month, our October program, it will not be on a Monday because that's Columbus Day. So just looking ahead, our October program will be on Tuesday, October 15. We will, of course, send you notification to that effect. One other quick announcement. We have had some website issues, which has caused us to finally say, guess what? We're getting a new website, and it's going to be swell. And it will take us a few more weeks, but our new website will be so easy to navigate, so flexible. It will have so many features, so much more content. We will be so proud to unveil it. Give us a few more weeks and we'll tell you more about it. It's about time. Okay. Are there any other announcements that anybody in the audience would like to share? Anything of interest with the group? Yes, Gresh.
A glass case?
An eyeglass case was left at the check-in desk.
What am I did? Going.
It belongs to someone.
Gone. It'll be right here.
Okay, you'll know you left it, and it's on the table over there. All right. Announcements are done. Let us get on with the program. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Major General, retired U.S. Army, Bill Chen. Bill Chen's grandfather came to America in the late 1800s as part of a wave of Chinese laborers who helped build the American railroad system. Both his son and his grandson went on to have distinguished careers both in the military and in aviation. Bill Chen is a retired Major General of the U.S. Army, the first Chinese American to reach this rank. He's going to tell us first about the amazing career of his father, Moon Chen, and then he'll highlight the similarities and the differences in his own distinguished 32-year career in missiles, air and missile defense. Bill was a student at the University of Michigan in 1958 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 and the U.S. launched its space program. He knew right then that he wanted to be in missiles. After earning bachelor's and master's degrees in aeronautical engineering, he was commissioned in the regular Army in 1961, and he served in recurring missile and air defense assignments, worked on major missile systems, and in 1989, he achieved his dream job as Commanding General, U.S. Army Missile Command. He has lots of interesting things to tell us. Please welcome Bill Chen.
Thank you, Linda, for that nice introduction. The title of my presentation is shown, and then on the upper left, for example, is a picture of my father in World War II. He had his service cap on, so I picked a picture of myself in a service cap. Now, in the military, we have this terminology called covered and uncovered. So when you're without your hat, picture of my father, and what you can see is we have the same hairstyle. Now, this picture of my father was taken on the day that I got pinned on my first star as a brigadier general. He was 78 years old at that time, and he was able to live to 101. And this is a picture of me also at 78, and hopefully I have another 20 years to go. Okay, this is an outline of my presentation. I can't really talk about my father without talking about my grandfather. And for those of you that are familiar with Chinese, Chinese like to talk about paternal. But in my case, I'm a product of my father and my mother, so I want to also talk about my grandfather on the maternal side. Now, for father and son, I'm going to quickly go over the points that are shown in order to get to vignettes. And so the vignettes are little stories or occurrences, some of the experiences that my father and myself have had. And we're going to also have a little audience participation that I'll talk about later, associated with the vignettes. And then I'll have some comments on some interesting happenstances during my life, and then have some closing remarks. I'll talk about some memorable events and show some photos. Okay. My grandfather on my father's side, like other early Chinese immigrants, came from Guangdong province, and the specific area was Huiping. And so many of those, of course, came for the gold rush and the Transcontinental Railroad. And so my father worked on the Transcontinental Railroad from California to El Paso, Texas. And when they got to El Paso, then the workers were released. Two of his brothers were there, but they went back to China. Others went back to California, or they scattered. Somehow, my grandfather went to Mississippi, got into the grocery business. And apparently he did quite well. If you can imagine the time frame of, before the turn of the 19th century, somehow he saved enough money or did well enough that he went to New York City, where he met a matchmaker who then introduced him to my grandmother, who was 20 years younger. So then they went back to Mississippi. The first two kids were born in Mississippi. But because of racial tensions, they kind of lost out on the grocery business, and he migrated to Ohio. And my father was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1908. And later on he went to Canton, Ohio. Okay, on my mother's side, my grandfather was a Chinese classics scholar, also a founder of a university and professor. And he was also a vice minister of finance. So when you look at the two grandfathers, that's quite a difference. My father worked with his hands a lot. Probably the only time my other grandfather worked on his hands was, writing Chinese words and classics, etc. So the question then becomes, what is my DNA? And where will that be derived from? And maybe some of you can make some observations later on. Okay, I have a series of charts that have my father on the left-hand side, myself on the right-hand side. And so he was orphaned at 15, and he had to work his way through high school, through college, and also help support two of his siblings. He did, during the Depression, go to the University of Michigan and graduated in 1932 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. And some of you probably have grandchildren or children and whatnot, and you know that the average time in college has been gradually increasing year by year, maybe 6 years to graduate from college. He made it through in 4 years. But he wasn't able to find a job in aeronautical engineering during that time frame. Number one, it was the Depression. And number two, in those days, aircraft companies were not hiring Asians, even though he was born in the United States. But he had a passion for aviation. He saved enough money to learn how to fly, got a commercial pilot's license, and he went to China to work for an airline in 1935. He then continued on during World War II, became a military pilot. He flew C-46s and C-47s, and then after the war, he worked for an airline, and later he worked for an aircraft company. And in my case, I had a relatively easy life. I got a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering, and I pursued a career in Army missiles, air defense, and also missile defense. And afterwards, I worked in the defense industry for about 18 years and then retired. Okay, here's some parallels in education. I mentioned he went to the University of Michigan. I also went to the University of Michigan. A significant thing, as all of you know, was in the public universities, especially like in the Midwest, it was a land grant college, and he took ROTC while he was there at Michigan. And of course, fortunately, when the war started, he was able to go directly into the Army Air Force as a first lieutenant. I also was an ROTC graduate. I have there the FF fraternity, and you'll hear me talk about it a number of times in my presentation. The FF fraternity was a fraternity for Chinese and Chinese Americans here in the US. In fact, we have 2 members, Larry Ho, Art Chen, that are here, and I'll talk about that later. Now, in my father's time frame, there weren't many that went back to school to get an MBA. He did go to an advanced management program at Michigan. And then the last bullets there, both he and I were designated as distinguished graduates of the Aerospace Engineering Department at Michigan. And in 2014, they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first university in the United States to offer an undergraduate education in aerospace engineering, even beating out MIT. Now, they actually asked me in the big reunion for one of the reunion dinners to talk about my father, and so I did. Now, is anybody here from Ohio? Oh, one. Okay, you know about Ohio. You know about Ohio State.
Yeah.
And you know, everybody knows about the rivalry in football between Ohio State and Michigan. So at this reunion dinner, when they asked me to speak, what I said was, my father was a Buckeye by birth. But he went to Michigan, and he was always rooting for Michigan when it was Ohio State versus Michigan. Okay, now one difference that you see there, though, is that he received a Distinguished Service Award from Michigan, and I didn't. So he was more service-oriented than I was. Okay, now there are differences. And the first bullet you see was, in my opinion, you know, he kind of grew up as an orphan. He had to work his way himself. So he was trained and graduated in the School of Hard Knocks. And he had to learn a lot by himself. He also had a booming voice. he would go into a room and he would know how to work a room. And he would always gather other people around him because they wanted to be near him. So clearly he was highly connected and affable, well-liked and sought out. Now, all of you probably know about masonry. You know, you have 32nd degree Masons that are Scottish Rite. My father happened and luckily was a 33rd degree Mason. So that's quite unusual and probably one of the few, if any, of Chinese origin who became a 33 degree Mason. He was always, he was an alumni president, so he was again active in the service business. And for example, this FF fraternity that I talked about, he was a national chairman actually 2 years after he got his bachelor's degree and was there as a national chairman for almost 3 years. Larry Ho, for example, was a national chairman. And so, you know, that represents, you know, wanting to help others and then on a national basis be in a leadership position. And when you look at my side, I would evaluate myself, if he were rated on a 1 to 10 scale, my father would be a 10 and I would be like a 2 or something. Okay. What I'd like to now talk about are the major influences on our respective careers. And the first one on his side is his Michigan education. And he would tell us, meaning his sons, my older brother, younger brother, myself, that about the value of his Michigan education. Not necessarily the academics, but meeting people, whether they're classmates, peers, you know, friends, professors, etc., and learning from the others there, from the people-to-people relationships in terms of gathering that experience. The second major impact and influence on his career was becoming a pilot. And this is during the Depression. And he actually wrote a few words that my mother captured, talking about flying above the clouds, where it's quiet and peaceful, serenity. And of course, what he did say was, hopefully, not having to necessarily get back on the ground to have to do the hard work and the harsh conditions during the Depression. But that gave him confidence, being a pilot and skilled in that area during that time period. Now, the third major influence was working for General Chennault during the war. And of course, my father was a pilot in the 14th Air Force. In addition to flying, he got assigned as General Chennault's personal representative and liaison officer to the Chinese Air Force located then in Chongqing. And of course, the government, the Chinese government was located there. So in effect, he was Chennault's liaison officer to the government as well. But through that series of assignments, and after World War II, Chennault founded an airline, and my father joined that, as well as a lot of others that were under General Chennault in the 14th Air Force. And so it gave him an opportunity to occupy leadership positions. He was able to establish good relationships, and that really helped him in his career. In my case, you know, like any other undergraduate going in as a freshman, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But what happened in 1957? Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the shot heard around the world. The first satellite, and that satellite, of course, was the Soviet Union satellite. The U.S. response to that, the first response, was the Vanguard system, and some of you know that that failed. But the first successful U.S. satellite was Explorer 1. And Explorer 1 was led by Dr. Wernher von Braun. Dr. Wernher von Braun at that time was with the Army Ballistic Missile Agency at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. In those days, I was a sophomore at that time. In those days, there was no such thing as the internet, right? You could just Google whatever and find out everything. So I went to the library to look at magazines, newspaper articles, whatever books there were about von Braun and the German scientists coming to the United States. And then, of course, I learned that the Jupiter Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile was the missile that launched the Explorer 1 satellite. And that was all under the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And then I said to myself, I was a sophomore, I was taking ROTC at the time, and I said, when I go on active duty, I want to be a part of Army missiles and rockets. And that's what happened to me. So that was a first major influence. A second one was becoming, and actually before that, aspiring to be an Army project manager. Now, my first assignment in the Army was on the operational aspects of missile systems. I was assigned to a Nike Hercules site. I was also assigned to what was called the NORAD, North American Air Defense Command Center, Army Air Defense Command Post, and I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. My second assignment in the Army was to the Army Missile Command, where I was assigned to a project that did experiments in anti-tactical ballistic missile systems, where we actually shot against incoming missiles. And you can ask me about that during the question and answer period on how that came about. So the job I had there then was in a Army project manager's office headed up by a colonel. And of course we had a prime contractor. In those days it was Bell Telephone Labs and Western Electric, who were in the early days of ballistic missile defense. And of course then I was a first lieutenant at the time, but the big boss was that Army colonel, and I said to myself, I want to be an Army project manager like that Army colonel. Okay, a third major impact is as shown there, where I worked for a 4-star and a 3-star. But it was the second time I worked for those same 4 stars and 3 stars. When the 4-star was a 2-star, I was a lieutenant colonel, he was a 2-star. I was in the Pentagon in the office of the Chief of Staff Army, working for him, and that's where he got to know me. For the 3-star, when he was a 2-star, I was a colonel, and I was a project manager under him. So what happened was they had a brigadier general project manager on a big program, a big air defense program, but they needed to fire that brigadier general because the program was in trouble. Then they had to find a replacement, and they picked me. So, you know, is that luck? Is that good fortune? However, when people found out I got appointed to that job, and that job was not with the promotion, I was still a colonel, and they were filling that brigadier general position with me as a colonel, my friends would hear about that and say, I don't know whether to congratulate you or give you condolences, because the program was in trouble, and if you want to hear about what happened, I'll tell you about that later. Okay, so I took over a troubled program, but fortunately, with some good bosses and some hard work, we survived. I got promoted to 1-star, and very shortly after that, promoted to 2-star. Okay, all right, so this is a recap of my father's career progression. And so once he got his commercial pilot's license, he also flew for the U.S. Mail Service across the country. In those days, it was these biplanes, you know, open cockpit, you know, biplanes. That's how he got his suntan. Okay, then he went to China and he worked for an airline called CNAC, China National Aviation Corporation, which was owned and, well, partially owned by Pan American World Airways. He also flew and worked for a company called Camco, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. And so if some of you have heard about the American Volunteer Group that became known as the Flying Tigers under a retired Claire Chennault. That was the organization that Claire Chennault led, was called the American Volunteer Group. But Camco was the front. They were all employees of Camco. Camco was headed by William Pauly, who was the Curtiss Wright Corporation representative in China. And so all the employees, all the pilots, all the ground crew that went to China, to include Chennault, were employees of Camco. And of course that was the United States' first covert operation in China against the Japanese, the American Volunteer Group, and they were Camco employees. Then when Pearl Harbor started, my father got integrated in the 14th Air Force, working for General Chennault. Chennault at that time was a brigadier general. He got called back to active duty, became a brigadier general, and then when he commanded the 14th Air Force, he became a major general. Okay, after the war then, Chennault, I mentioned about him being a liaison officer, which really was a colonel's job. But the colonel that was there probably was a little bit too arrogant in working with the headquarters of the Chinese Air Force, and Chennault put my father there, even though he was a captain that we normally would associate with as a junior officer. Okay, then after World War II, Chennault formed an airline. I'll talk about that later, and so my father joined that and had successive positions working for the airline. And later on, he worked for Northrop Aircraft Corporation. So down the bottom, you see what I call his story arc, right? He was initially not hireable by an aircraft company, but he became a pilot, commercial pilot, military pilot, then airline executive, and a Northrop Aircraft Company executive. Now in my case, I told you about my interest in missiles and air defense. I aspired to be a project manager. I had successive assignments in project management. I was there as a lieutenant, and that's where we had initial experiments shooting down other tactical missiles, and that established the technical feasibility of being able to shoot down missiles. Later on, I worked for a project management office called the SAMD, Surface to Air Missile Development Project, and that became today's Patriot system. Actually, back a few years before that, I worked on the requirements for the SAMD system. Then I worked in the project office, working with Raytheon then, in their engineering development of the SAMD system, which was called Patriot in 1976. I also became a project manager on a Chaparral missile system, which was a ground-based system that used the Sidewinder missile. You may have heard about the Sidewinder air-to-air missile that was infrared, and so I worked on the system that had a ground-based version of that as a surface-to-air missile. Okay, then along the way, of course, for those of you that have had active military service, no matter what your specific military occupational specialty is, they like to send you to a combat zone because they need the people to serve in the combat zone. So I've actually volunteered for Vietnam, and I also volunteered for Laos. And through that, I was able to get an accelerated promotion to lieutenant colonel. I also held high-level staff assignments in the Pentagon. I was there as a lieutenant colonel, I was there as a colonel, and then as a brigadier general. So along the way, I commanded a battalion. We have a compatriot here who was there at the time at Aberdeen Proving Ground in one of the sister battalions. I achieved my goal of becoming a colonel project manager, and then I began to think about, hey, what are my chances then of becoming a major general and getting that, or getting promoted to general. And I did command the U.S. Army Missile Command as a 2-star. Later on, I was the program executive officer for missile defense. So I was in charge of all the Army's theater missile defense programs and national missile defense programs. So as an example, the Army project manager that had the Patriot system was under me. Okay, then after I retired from the Army, I held a number of positions in a defense company. So my arc is as shown down the bottom, which allowed me to achieve my aspirations, have some good experiences, and get promoted. Now, I also need to talk about the other halves, right? Because for all of you that have the other half, most of the time, it's really your success depends upon the other half. So when you look on my mother's side, in those days, women didn't go to college. So she went to a missionary school in Shanghai called the McTeer School. But once she was with my father, she was active in international wives clubs and volunteer activities. She did have to have multiple moves, and where we lost a lot of our household goods and whatever. She did have to survive Japanese attacks during the Sino-Japanese War. And on my side, my wife Sandra, she made it. Okay, so she graduated from college in Hong Kong and also at Columbia. And when I was on active duty, for example, I was a battalion commander, and that was her first exposure to Army life and how to handle all those other wives activities. When I was a 2-star commander at the U.S. Army Missile Command, and she became president of the Officers' Wives Club, president of the Red Cross, all these volunteer activities. And that's the meaning of the Army got a twofer, right? 2 for 1. Okay. Here's where we can have a little fun. I'm glad to see that we have a left-hand side and a right-hand side. Now, on the chart, there's a left-hand side and a right-hand side. But what I want to do is alternate, and when I first call on your side here, you can pick whichever column you want and just call out what it is you want me to talk about. Like, all you have to do is say, Bill, hey, what do you mean by such and such? So I'm going to start out with the left-hand side, then I'll go to the right-hand side and alternate. Anybody want to? Yes?
Blank page approach. Blank page approach.
Blank page approach. Okay, I told you about taking over that Brigadier General's position. Okay, there was actually congressional language that said the Army shall conduct an operational evaluation of this system, and they would withhold procurement funding pending completion of that operational evaluation. Now, I took over that particular program like in, August of that year, But when I got there, nothing had been done, even though the responsible project manager at the time knew about all this congressional language. And so, meanwhile, the operational evaluation responsibility belonged to another agency. That agency was commanded by a 2-star general called the U.S. Army Operational Test and Evaluation Agency. But when I got there, nothing had been done. You know, where is the funding to do that test? Where is the operational range that we're going to do? What is the test plan? Nothing had been done. Now, in terms of a project manager, you know, that operational test wasn't my responsibility. But each project manager had a charter that said, hey, you're responsible for coordinating all the activities involving the Army. So what I started to call meetings in my project office, inviting the operational testers, inviting the other representatives to say, we need to develop this test plan, we need to get on with this operational evaluation, etc. And what I did was, I took a blank page approach. In other words, let's start out with a blank page. Let's fill in what we know. You know, there's some things you could know, and what does that tell us? All the blanks tell us what we need to work on. And that's what we did. Okay, let's go to this side. Yes?
Marco Polo Bridge.
Okay, those of you that know a little bit about the Sino-Japanese War know that that second Sino-Japanese War started on July 7th, 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge. Okay, it turned out that when my father was flying for this airline, he flew the route from Shanghai to Peking. And on that very day of the incident, he flew over the Marco Polo Bridge, saw the fighting, and immediately got on the radio to report back the initiation of this Japanese war against the Chinese. But there's another incident related to that. Okay, he landed in Peking. And then the Japanese on the ground started to have all these roadblocks and establishing roadblocks. So he was in Peking. Luckily, he knew the Postmaster General, and the Postmaster General helped by giving him a mail truck, loaded it with mail bags, and then he hid behind the mail bags. Now, when they made their way to the airport, of course, they got to the roadblocks. And so at the roadblocks, Japanese soldiers would come in, and then they actually poked into the mailboxes. But luckily, my father is shorter than I am. He hid in the back, and he was able to scramble once he got to the airfield to get to the airplane, get the crew there, and then the Japanese army was following. They started shooting at the aircraft, but luckily the airplane was able to take off. So he saved that aircraft. All right, now, that is related to Summon by Sun Fo. Anybody know who Sun Fo is? Yes?
Sun Yat-sen.
Okay. Sun Yat-sen was the leader who established the Republic of China. He had a son called Sun Fo, and at that time he was in Nanking with the legislative, heading up the legislative branch of the government. So when Sun Fo heard about this aircraft that escaped from Peking and that the aircraft was saved, he said, hey, I want to meet that pilot. And so that's how my father got summoned to Nanking to meet with Sun Fo, and then he got some sort of, laudatory commendation, something. Let me go on with that story. Sun Fo had a daughter. And then my father was working for this airline that was at that time in the Republic of China in Taipei. I was in school here in the US, but during the summer I would go visit my parents in Taipei. So this one summer, I was probably 15 years old. Then I see this beautiful girl come to visit our house, and she was having an appointment to be interviewed by my father. And of course, I asked my mother, who is this girl? And she said, oh, that is Sun Fo's daughter. And she's interviewing to become an airline hostess for this airline that Chenault founded. And sure enough, she got hired, and she was actually maybe only 17 at the time, as the youngest stewardess to be hired in that airline. Okay, where are we? Left or right side now? Left side. Art.
Representative Charlie Wilson and Stingers.
Oh,
I read
okay.
that book.
Does anybody know who Representative Charlie Wilson is from Texas? Right. He was a Texas congressman, and during the time of the early Afghanistan war, he was a big advocate for the Stinger missile. The Stinger missile was an Army, shoulder-fired weapon, and so he was a big promoter and was able to get U.S. Stinger missiles to be used in Afghanistan. At that time, I was a brigadier general. I was in the Pentagon, and I would go to congressional testimony to support the missile appropriation budget by the House Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee for Defense. Charlie Wilson was on that committee. So, of course, the budget includes everything that the Army has, what it wants for procurement of Army missiles, and I was there to testify. But here's Charlie Wilson. He sees me, and he starts asking me questions about, hey, what do you think of the Stinger missile? And of course, I knew about the Stinger missile, and then he must have had a dialogue with me back and forth for about 20 minutes on nothing more than Stingers and Stinger missiles in Afghanistan. So what happens after that? Well, if he took up all that time in the committee, that was less time for them to drill me on the other aspects of the missile appropriation. So we all had a lot of fun. Okay, this side of the room. Yes?
Madam Chang at General Chenault's funeral.
Oh, yes. Okay, Madam Chang did attend General Chenault's funeral in 1958. General Chenault had a case of bronchitis. He was in the hospital, but then he passed away. Now, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, okay, she can go anywhere she wants, right? If it so happened that she wanted to attend the General Chenault funeral and she was elsewhere, she could hop on an airplane and attend. But what facilitated that was in 1958, that summer, Madam Chang was at Ann Arbor, Michigan, and received an honorary degree from the University of Michigan. It turns out my father was there too. And how did she get that honorary degree from Michigan? Well, it was because years before that, my father was president of the Alumni Association. He hosted a lot of visitors, to include the president of the university, head of engineering, etc. And of course, they decided there that, hey, maybe we should arrange it so the University of Michigan would grant her an honorary degree. And so the fact that she was already in country for that honorary degree facilitated that attendance at the General Chenault funeral. And of course, during World War II, with the American Volunteer Group and Flying Tigers, Madam Chiang Kai-shek was actually the head of the Chinese Air Force. And of course, her English was exceptional, and she was able to get along well with General Chenault, which facilitated support from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, this side, yes, Larry.
Saying no to the Secretary of Army twice.
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, at that time, I was a major general. I was what was called the Program Executive Officer for Missile Defense. So all the missile defense programs reported to me. At that time, there was a little bit of competition between Raytheon, that had the Patriot system, and a company, L'Oreal, which got acquired by Lockheed Martin. So you know where Raytheon is, right? And the congressional delegation was headed up by Senator Ted Kennedy. Now, it turned out that the company in Texas was located in Dallas, and who was the representative there? Charlie Wilson. So here it is, I'm in charge of this selection, so to speak, and the methodology for that selection of these two competing systems. The Raytheon system was based upon a blast fragmentation warhead and fusing. So that you had a fuse that was on board the interceptor. It detected the closeness of the incoming missile, and then they gave you a potential intercept point, and then they guided the missile toward that space point, and then ignited the fragmentation warhead. On the other hand, the L'Oreal and Lockheed Martin system was called hit to kill. And so that technology is kinetic energy. That technology means you have a sensor on board and you actually hit the incoming, and you don't need a warhead then. All right, so we had these big issues of, the technology difference, the two major contractors, the congressional delegations that wanted to support their companies, etc. And I was in charge. And so the Secretary of the Army gave me a phone call one time and said, what can we do to make a decision? And of course, unfortunately, or somehow I knew that immediately prior to that, he had a visit from the chairman of the board of one of the companies. Okay? And so I had to say no to the Secretary of the Army, because I told him that the criteria was based upon engineering data, flight test data, which we hadn't completed yet, and hardware in the loop simulations, which we hadn't completed yet. And we'll be in a position to make a decision when we complete those. And so I had to say no to the Secretary of the Army. Now, it turned out maybe about 3 or 4 months later, he got another visit. And I got a call from the Secretary of the Army, and I had to say no again. So that's the story. Now, did I know the Secretary? I was a 2-star general, and most 2-star generals probably don't know the Secretary of the Army. But it turns out that when I was a brigadier general in the Pentagon, the Secretary of the Army was the undersecretary, and then later on he got elevated. Okay, this side of the room. Yes?
I'm curious. Originally, Harold Bixby was sent over to China to establish an airline in China. And I noticed that you mentioned Pan Am Airways.
Oh, you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, why did that occur?
Okay. What is the meaning of Pan American Airways divestitures of CNAC? Well, they owned about 20%, maybe 30%. And of course, the time frame then was about 1949, late 1948. And of course, the history at that time period was the Chinese communists were slowly taking over the China mainland. So at that time, Pan American Airways felt that, okay, they want to divest of their share in this airline CNAC. Now, at that time, my father wasn't working for CNAC. He was working for this airline that Chenault founded called CAT, civil air transport. However, he was known to the, Ministry of Communications and all that, and he was asked to help in the negotiations. So the negotiations took place, there was actually an agreement, and then CNAC had to cut a check for the amount. And of course, in those days, I don't think they had much in terms of wireless, delivery of funds or wiring funds, so they actually produced a check, a multi-million-dollar check that they asked my father to hand carry to the Pan American office in Hong Kong. So what happened is the airplane took off, they were headed for Hong Kong, but there was some sort of typhoon and they had to be diverted to an island called the Hainan Island. And then they were stuck there until they could fly again. So for about 2 days, here it is, you can visualize my father babysitting a multi-million-dollar check that he had to sleep with, eat with, etc. all that time. So that's something hilarious. Okay, if you want to know more about airlines, you can ask as well. Okay, anybody here on the left side? Yes.
First off, go blue.
Pardon me?
Go blue.
Oh, go blue, right.
Yeah. Okay, it's the top one there. Targets for anti-tactical missiles. And were you ever at White Sands?
Yeah, right. Okay. The first bullet there, targets. Okay, I mentioned that I was assigned as a lieutenant to this project office, and we dealt with early experiments in anti-tactical missile defense. And what we used as an interceptor was the Nike Hercules missile, which was a surface-to-air missile. Then we had a special modification of the Nike Hercules radar, so it would have a higher elevation angle in order to cover the incoming ballistic missiles. And so we had a system, hardware system radar, called the Hercules Anti-Tactical Ballistic Missile Radar. And I was a lieutenant there, and I was put in charge of flight testing. But how do we get targets to shoot at? Well, we could get our own missiles, namely Nike Hercules missiles, and at White Sands Missile Range, the radar that we had was located at the south end. So if we could take our Nike Hercules missiles, move it up north, and then shoot against them. But what the Army had for land-based missiles, like the Honest John or the Sergeant missile, they shot from a south to north trajectory. So they weren't good for us. However, what I thought about was, why can't we get these missiles to fire north to south? So the agency that was in charge was somebody called the Field Artillery Ballistic Missile Agency at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, headed by a colonel. Here it is, I'm a first lieutenant. So I called up the office and I made an appointment to meet the colonel, and I told him about what we wanted to do, and I asked him, could they move their launch site so that they fired north to south? Then we could engage them as targets. And after a little thought, they said, hey, what they're firing is what they call annual service practice. You qualify a crew and you fire, or you have graduation firings. People finish school and they get to shoot. And so what they said is, hey, that's a great idea, because we could go to this site called the Stallion site, 100 miles away of, White Sands Missile Range. They could have a bivouac, go camping, and get some experience that way, and that's what they agreed to. And so that's how we got it. And you may have heard of the Redstone missile. That's a liquid propellant missile. They even shot Redstone missiles, and we were able to shoot that down. Okay, here. Yes.
I'll go with the elevator speech.
Okay, I like that one. Okay, what is an elevator speech? Anybody know what a lot of people, anybody in marketing or whatnot, what's an elevator speech?
Summarizing your brief. You have 3 minutes to really sell something.
Right, exactly. So here it is. I told you I took over this program from this Brigadier General. And here it was, we needed funding, we needed the range site, we needed a test plan. And so there was one day there where I got invited to go to Fort Bliss, Texas. The Vice Chief of Staff was there and a whole bunch of generals, like about a dozen generals. And I told you I had this 3-star boss. And so I told the 3-star boss, I need to see General Thurman, the 4-star, and hopefully maybe you can help me get in during breakfast or something, and I need to talk to him. But that didn't work out. So we followed the whole agenda for this air defense review, and it lasted until 3 o'clock. Now this General Thurman, I don't know whether his first name was Max, but he was one of the smartest Army generals there were. His last assignment was, after being the Vice Chief of Staff, was he was the commander of the Southern Command. At the time that they captured, who was that?
Noriega.
Yeah, Noriega. He captured Noriega. Okay, so here's 3 o'clock, and they had this auditorium there with these seats that kind of went up in the back, and I was sitting in the back. All the generals were sitting where they could see the screen out front in a table. So this General Thurman turns around. He remembered my request, and he said, Billy. He called me Billy. Everybody else calls me Bill. He says, Billy, what have you got? And of course, my intention was a private conversation with them. So here I am, I'm walking down the stairs, and I say to myself, what am I going to talk about in front of all these people? And so I made my points short, and here's my elevator speech. Sir, I need your help. For the operational evaluation, we need funding, we need a test plan, and we need a test range. That's all I said. And of course, what does the ranking 4-star do? He turns to a 3-star. His first name was Lou. Lou, what are you doing about this? Okay, then you know how it is. He says, well, it has to do with the color, money. You know, we have procurement funding that we could divert, but we really need this operational and maintenance category of money. And so anyways, that did it. Because we were able to get the funding, we were able to get a test range, and we got this operational test and evaluation agency to do their thing. But guess what? This auditorium had a lieutenant colonel that was the representative of the commanding general of the operational test and evaluation agency that was responsible for all of this. So guess what he does? After the meeting, he gets on the phone, and I'm sure the conversation was, hey, that Chen told the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army that blah, blah, blah. And here's the other aspect of the story. Okay, that was a 2-star general that was the commander of the operational. And of course, I had only met him once, but we got to know each other because of this operational evaluation. The one lesson learned that all of us should have is don't burn your bridges, right? Because that 2-star got promoted to 4-star. I got promoted to 2-star, and I was a subordinate to him when I commanded the U.S. Army Missile Command. So, you know, we got to get our job done, but there's got to be a little, you know, mellowing, sense of humor, don't let your emotions drive you, etc. Okay, let's have somebody on this side. Yes. Okay.
I'd love to hear about the battalion commander leadership process.
Yeah, great. I like that. Okay, so I was a battalion commander. This was 1977 time frame. It was before the all-volunteer Army. Okay, now immediately prior to being a battalion commander, I was a staff officer in the Pentagon in the Office of the Chief of Staff, Army. Okay, so what do staff officers do? You know, they develop plans, they analyze, they give recommendations, etc. So if you're in a battalion with troops and soldiers, you know, what's an important element? Discipline. What are the discipline indicators? Well, I think all of you know AWOL, right? Absent without leave. Another is Article 15, non-judicial punishment. And so I did an analysis for the past year of all our disciplinary actions, and my conclusion was there's a strong correlation between high school graduation and people that have discipline problems. So that's what I briefed to the battalion commander, to the brigade commander, that, you know, what we're really talking about is the need for high school graduates. And you know what he told me? He says, he points his finger at me and says, that's your problem. That's a leadership problem. You know, you got to work with what you have instead of, now, what happened in the real world after that? When the Army went to an all-volunteer Army, it was based upon graduation from high school. Okay, I'm going to go on. Here's some interesting happenstances that relates to a person by the name of T.C. Shi. It turns out that T.C. Shi was a member of the FF fraternity, a graduate of MIT. And so when my father first went to China, he stayed at the guest house of the fraternity because it was cheap and they served meals there. But if you fast, and one of the first conversations was, you know, T.C. Shi asked my father, what are you doing here? And he tells him, well, I want to try and get a job and fly. If we fast forward 40-some years afterwards, what happens? It turns out that T.C. Shi's granddaughter is Sandra, my wife. Okay, my father flew Curtiss-Wright aircraft, and I told you about Camco, headed up by the Curtiss-Wright representative. Here I am in graduate school. I applied for a fellowship, and they gave me a Curtiss-Wright Corporation fellowship. Absolutely no connections whatsoever. Okay, my father worked for Chenault. He was at Maxwell Field teaching pursuit aviation tactics. It turns out even though I'm Army, I went to the Air Command and Staff College, and I had a course in pursuit aviation tactics. Now, the airline that my father worked for that Chenault founded was called CAT. Anybody hear of Air America here? Okay, Air America was in Southeast Asia during the war, but the company, CAT, which was American-owned, morphed into Air America. When I was in Laos and Thailand, I used Air America. All right, here's a picture of me, 1943. The spirit of World War II. Here's my mother in a World War II hairstyle, right? So the title of this could be The Spirit of World War II, where my mother dresses me up in uniform. Now another title could be Living Our Dreams. Who would have dreamed that somebody in 1943 could rise to the rank of Major General? But it's only in America. It's only in America that a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker could become a Major General in the Army. Okay, I won't spend much time on that, but it started with my father. His three sons were all in the Army, and then my younger brother's daughter currently is on active duty as a helicopter pilot. Okay, closing remarks. I think the point here is that my father worked in an occupation where there were few Chinese Americans. He also was part of the greatest generation, World War II, who served and then reverted to civilian life. And the World War II veterans, of course, helped pave the way for follow-on generations of Chinese Americans in the military. Now, the last bullet there, my father was American born, but he would say those words in Chinese, 我是中国人, because he felt that his roots were Chinese, and he actually went to China based upon a deathbed wish of his mother to go to China and help China modernize. Okay, his last gesture was a thumbs up. What does thumbs up mean? A-OK, right? So, but there's a dual meaning. For those of you that are Chinese, what does thumbs up mean in Chinese?
Ding hao.
Ding hao, right. So that was his last gesture, and I think part of it was that he gave the thumbs up gesture to also convey a satisfaction on a legacy of thumbs up. All right. Now, some of you may know of the name Dr. Hu Shi. He was a former scholar, president of Peking University, ambassador from China to the U.S. during World War II. In 1937, he was the officiator for my parents' wedding. And he said those words. And now, because of the wartime situation, we don't have any pictures back then of 1937, but in the 20th anniversary then, a picture of my parents and Dr. Hu Shi. Okay, I mentioned Camco. In the second row on the far left is William Pauley, who was head of Camco, and my father is shown on the right-hand side. And of course, Camco supported the all-volunteer group that became the Flying Tigers. And this is just a short recap of the American Volunteer Group, the 14th Air Force, and then this is from General Chennault's book, the very last part of his book, where he says that it's my fondest hope that the sign of the Flying Tiger will remain aloft as long as necessary, and will always be remembered on both shores of the Pacific as a symbol of two great peoples working toward a common goal in war and in peace. Okay, this is the symbol of the 14th Air Force, and then they started out as part of a China recovery and rehab project, and they became known as CAT, Civil Air Transport. But it's an airline that was American owned, even though it flew the Chinese Republic of China flag, and then became a regional airline. Here's a picture of myself, 1966 in Vietnam. I was a captain at that time. And some of you may know the Hmong population here in the U.S. The Hmong were a tribesman in Laos. It was headed up by General Vang Pao, and I was there in 1974, probably the last American officer on the ground in Long Chen, Vietnam, with General Vang Pao. And the significance of Vang Pao and the Hmong soldiers were by him fighting the North Vietnamese in Laos, it eliminated the need for the U.S. to send force structure to Laos. And I was in charge of the very last major effort, the Long Chen Logistics Improvement Project, where we wanted to outfit him with ammunition and logistics support capabilities. And here's a picture of Long Chen. You come in on this airstrip, and then you come into a mountain or karst at the end. And if you look you may not be able to see, but you can see some T-28 aircraft on the airstream. Here's a picture of me when I assumed command of the U.S. Army Missile Command. President Bush visited. Here's a picture of me, and now I'm open to your questions and answers.
As usual, we would ask that you speak into the mic. Ed, will you take that side, Ed or Gresh? Okay, who would like to ask the first question? Don't be shy. Gresh will. All right.
General, will you comment about the rise of China now, currently?
Okay, well, I think what we see, of course, is China is a big country. It has population growth. There's expansion of the economy. They have a good educational system, very competitive. And so they're becoming, of course, a threat to the United States. Unfortunately, there are some that view it as too much of a threat in all areas, whether it's, technology, military capability, or whatever. But what we need to do is find ways to cooperate and live peacefully.
Thank you.
Over here, just a moment.
Thank you. As I mentioned before the meeting, I have a personal interest. My son is in the Air Force right now. He's a captain, grew up from Lexington, and very few Lexingtonians, I'm sure you heard about all the stereotypical Chinese descendants. They want to be lawyers and doctors and engineers. But my son, after graduating from college, went to be an Airman 1, meaning almost the lowest ranking Air Force person. And now he's a pilot and a captain. In your career of all these years, do you see, especially like a Chinese American like my son, what does he need to do to at least to get promoted, or at least to be whatever he wants to do? Do you have a mentorship type of thing? You said you met a 3-star or 4-star general in your career, but for him as a captain, all he saw all day was probably the commander-in-chief, which is maybe a colonel. What does he need to do to advance in this kind of environment in the United States?
Okay, well, in all the military services, they have what's called an officer efficiency report, which is the rating and evaluation system. And so there are two components of that. One component is your performance, in other words, how you're doing what you're assigned to do. The second element of that is an evaluation of potential. Given how you're performing, and the supervisor then makes an evaluation of what is your potential to serve in positions higher than your current position. So the first piece of advice is, of course, you need to emphasize doing well and getting good evaluations based upon performance and potential. Now, it's easy enough to say, but what else needs to be done? And I think an important element for everybody is, number one, you need to be able to express yourself so that they can evaluate who you are, how well you can give a presentation, how well you can communicate, whether it's in writing or orally, because they will evaluate you based upon what they observe. And so at this point, you don't necessarily need to try and say, hey, I want a mentor, I want somebody to help me on that. I think that if you demonstrate outstanding qualities, you will be recognized and people will help you. But you have to have also this personal relationship, the ability to get along with people. And they will find opportunities for you. Because if they're your boss, they're going to have to, at some point in time, fill positions or send somebody to represent the unit or command elsewhere. And if they know about you, then they'll send you. And then you can do a job well and they'll get the feedback.
Okay. Who's next?
Relatively simple, but perhaps not quite so simple question. Since I do dabble in the stock market, knowing, let's say, the Chinese mindset typically of thinking ahead more like 100 years rather than 6 months, what do you think the chances are of resolving the Trump versus China tariff issues? In a way, that's a win-win situation for both sides.
Well, I'm no expert, but I dabble in stocks too. But what I would say is our current administration probably is smart enough to know that with the election coming up, that the stock market better be in a good condition at the time the decisions are made for the election. So from that standpoint, I feel relatively confident that some resolution of the tariff situation will occur.
Bill, next question.
Yeah, I can understand that your hero was your father, and your passion for interest in flying was through him. And I think, like myself, which preceded you by a few decades, closer to your father, our heroes were like Howard Hughes, Rickenbacker, Lindbergh, and other flyers of that time. And I have a feeling that influenced your father as well.
Well, my father's hero was Charles Lindbergh,
Okay.
because my father took his flying lessons in Roosevelt Field in Long Island, the same departure airfield as Charles Lindbergh.
I just want to make a comment about this idea about China has a 100-year plan. I've talked to a lot of Chinese engineers and scientists from China. Their complaint is they're very short-term sighted. Specifically, about 10 years ago, I gave a lecture at MIT and talked to an executive formerly from a Chinese automobile company. And they say they're just thinking about tomorrow. They're not putting any money into developing new things. Okay. Now, there's a different segment of society. They do have 5-year plans, but those are 5-year incremental plans. There's no, I don't think there's any 100-year plan.
Are you with the auto industry in China?
What?
Did you say you're with the auto industry in China?
No, I talked to somebody who was an executive in the Chinese auto industry. I mean, the Chinese auto industry has joint ventures with Americans, like General Motors. He felt they had problem in developing, this was 10 years ago, so they had problem in developing new cars and so forth. But maybe things have changed. When they get better at it, then they do have, I think they're willing to, they are now more interested in supporting advanced technology, like the quantum communication satellite and so forth.
Haven't we branched out onto different topics?
Yes, I have a question about the current events. You went to the University of Michigan, as did I, and you also have a strong feeling for the Army. What did you think about this weekend's football game against Michigan?
Well, the thought that came to my mind is whoever wins, I could say, my team won.
Oh, that's probably a very good, excellent time to end our program. Thank you so much. Well done, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. Let's see you next month, October 15, Tuesday. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon.
Okay.